You lie down in bed. The room is quiet. The light was turned off a few minutes ago, maybe longer. Your body slowly begins to sink into the mattress. Your shoulders relax. Your legs grow heavy. Your breathing slows a little. The day is over, at least on the outside. But inside, something is still on. A thought appears. Nothing important. Nothing urgent. Maybe a sentence someone said hours ago. Maybe something you need to do tomorrow. Maybe just a random memory. You let it pass. But another thought appears, and then another. Suddenly the mind seems busy, curiously busy, even when everything around you is finally quiet. Maybe you have experienced this many times. The body tired, the day finished, no emergency happening, and still, the mind remains active. It revisits conversations, simulates scenarios, reorganizes small things that already happened. Sometimes you even realize that none of that really needs to be solved right now. And still, the movement continues. This usually creates a silent question, a question many people never say out loud, but feel. Why can't my mind stop? Because it doesn't seem logical. If nothing is happening, why does the system keep functioning as if something is? During the day, this goes unnoticed. There are tasks, conversations, traffic, notifications. The mind follows the rhythm of the world. But when the environment slows down, something curious happens. Silence does not produce silence. It reveals movement, as if suddenly you could hear a machine that has always been running in the background, a kind of continuous activity. And many people interpret this in the same way. They think they are thinking too much. They think they are anxious. They think they should be able to switch off. But there is something important that almost no one explains. The mind was not designed to shut down simply because the day ended. It was designed to observe, monitor, detect signals. For thousands of years, survival meant noticing changes before they became dangerous. A strange sound, a different facial expression, an unexpected movement. The human brain evolved to recognize patterns, to anticipate scenarios, to predict what might happen. And that system is still running today, even when you are simply lying in a quiet room. Perhaps the most intriguing part is this. For the nervous system, silence does not automatically mean safety. Silence means lack of information. And when there is a lack of information, the brain begins to fill in the gaps. It imagines, projects, reviews, like a radar slowly rotating in search of signals. Not because something is wrong, but because that has always been its job. And this completely changes the way we understand a restless mind. Maybe your mind is not active because you think too much. Maybe it is active because some part of your system has not yet received a clear signal of safety, as if something inside you is still checking whether everything is really okay. And if that signal of safety never fully arrives, the system may keep running, even when, rationally, you know there is no danger at all. There is a quiet idea that follows many people without them realizing it. The idea that the mind should shut down when the day ends, as if the brain had an invisible switch. Work finished, lights off, thoughts closed. But the nervous system does not work that way. It does not turn off through rational decision. It turns off through the feeling of safety. And safety, for the body, is not simply the absence of problems. Safety is something the system needs to recognize, to feel, to confirm. There is a very old mechanism inside the organism that does exactly that. It is always observing the environment, always evaluating signals, the tone of people's voices, the emotional atmosphere of a place, body posture, the micro details of everything happening around you. This mechanism does not ask the conscious mind whether everything is okay. It simply decides, safe or alert. And when it decides that there is still some uncertainty, the system stays active, even if the rational mind says everything is under control. Maybe you recognize this kind of sensation. It is not fear. It is not panic. It is something more subtle, a small background tension, as if the body were waiting for something, even when nothing is happening. This happens because the nervous system does not react only to real dangers. It also reacts to learned patterns. If, throughout life, the brain needed to remain attentive for long periods, it becomes accustomed to that state. It learns that being vigilant is a form of protection, and when this learning settles deeply, the state of alert can become the default, even when the environment has already changed. Think of a home alarm. When it is armed, any small movement can trigger it. Not because there is an intruder, but because the system was programmed to react quickly. The human body does something similar. If the system learns that it needs to constantly monitor, it keeps monitoring, even during moments of rest. That is why many people experience a strange paradox. They are tired, but they cannot completely relax. They want to sleep, but the mind keeps running small thoughts, reviews, simulations, nothing truly important, but enough to keep the system active, because deep down, those thoughts are not exactly the problem. They are only the symptom, the visible signal of something deeper, a nervous system that has not yet recognized complete safety. And when the system does not recognize safety, it remains attentive, like a god who keeps walking the corridors even after everyone has gone to sleep. This does not mean something is wrong with you. In fact, it often means the opposite. It means your system learned to protect, learned to anticipate, learned to observe. The problem is that this learning can remain active even when it is no longer necessary. And then something curious happens. The mind continues producing thoughts, not because it needs to solve a real problem, but because the system is still checking the environment, looking for signals, searching for confirmation that everything is okay. And when that confirmation does not arrive clearly, the radar keeps spinning quietly. Maybe that is why some people feel that the mind never rests, not because it is broken, but because it is still trying to guarantee something very simple: safety. And this raises an interesting question. If the mind remains active because the system has not yet recognized safety, what exactly makes the body understand that it can finally relax? There is a curious detail in this experience that almost no one notices. When the mind stays active, the most common reaction is to try to control it. You notice a thought and immediately try to interrupt it. You try to push it away. You try to replace it with something more positive. You try to convince yourself that it does not make sense. But something strange happens. The more you try to silence the mind, the more present it seems to become. And this creates the feeling that something is wrong, as if the brain were out of control. But maybe what is happening is exactly the opposite. Maybe the system is simply responding to the way you are trying to deal with it. There is a quiet difference between observing a thought and trying to eliminate a thought. When you observe, the thought appears and passes, like a distant sound, like a car passing down the street. But when you try to eliminate it, something changes. The thought stops being just a mental event. It becomes a problem to solve. And solving a problem requires energy, requires attention, requires activation. So without realizing it, the effort to stop the mind sends a very specific signal to the nervous system. Something important is happening. Something needs to be corrected. Something needs to be monitored. And the system responds exactly the way it was trained to respond. It stays alert. This is one of the most interesting paradoxes of the human mind. The attempt to shut down the mind may be exactly what keeps the system turned on. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because the system interprets effort as a signal of threat. Imagine a completely calm lake. If you start hitting the surface of the water trying to eliminate the waves, what happens? The waves increase. Each attempt at control creates more movement. Something similar happens with the mind. When the system perceives constant effort to control thoughts, it understands that something needs to be resolved, and that keeps the radar active. Maybe that is why many people feel their mind speed up exactly when they try to slow it down. They enter an invisible cycle. They notice the thought. They try to interrupt it. The effort increases activation. Activation produces more thoughts. And then the feeling appears that something is wrong. But there is an important shift in perspective here. Maybe the problem was never the presence of thoughts. Maybe the problem is the internal state in which those thoughts appear. When the nervous system is in a state of alert, each thought feels more intense, more relevant, more urgent. But when the organism truly recognizes safety, thoughts can arise and disappear with much less weight. They pass, without creating turbulence, like leaves carried by the wind. This means the true center of the issue may not be in the mind. It may be in the state of the nervous system, in the mode in which the organism is operating in that moment. Because the human brain does not only decide what to think, it also decides in what emotional state the thought appears. And when that state is vigilance, even neutral thoughts can seem important. But when the state is safety, even complex thoughts can pass without creating agitation. Maybe that is why some people can relax easily even after a busy day, while others continue with an active mind even in moments of silence. It is not necessarily about the number of thoughts. It is about the internal state in which those thoughts arise. And this completely changes the question. Maybe the question is no longer, how do I make my mind stop? Maybe the question is another. What makes the nervous system understand that it is finally safe? There is a curious moment when something begins to change in the way you observe your own mind. Not when the thoughts disappear. They keep appearing, sometimes one after another. But something in your relationship with them begins to transform, because little by little, you notice a detail that used to go unnoticed. Maybe the problem was never the movement of the mind. The problem was the state in which that movement happened. For a long time, you may have interpreted each thought as something that needed to be solved, as if the mind were presenting problems that required immediate answers. But when the nervous system is in vigilance mode, it tends to treat almost everything as relevant. Even neutral thoughts gain weight. Even small memories seem important. Not because they really are, but because the system is still trying to confirm safety. And when you begin to see this more clearly, something interesting happens. The thought stops looking like a threat. It begins to look like movement, a natural activity of the mind, like wind passing through the trees. This does not mean the mind will completely stop. In fact, maybe it never completely stops. Thinking is part of the normal functioning of the brain. What changes is not the existence of thoughts. What changes is the internal state in which they appear. When the organism recognizes safety, the entire system changes rhythm. Breathing deepens, muscles release. The radar still exists, but it spins more slowly. Thoughts may arise, but they do not need to be chased. They do not need to be analyzed. They do not need to be fought. They simply appear and pass, like clouds crossing the sky. Maybe that is why some people report a curious experience. The moment the mind finally slows down usually does not happen when they try to force silence. It often happens when they stop fighting the mind's movement. When the system perceives that there is no conflict, that there is nothing to fight, that nothing urgent is happening. And that sends a very different signal to the body, a signal of safety. And when the body recognizes safety, something inside it begins to slow down naturally. Not because someone pressed a button, but because the entire system changed state. Maybe that is why the initial question of this video can now be seen in a different way. At the beginning, it seemed that the problem was the mind not stopping. But maybe that was never the real issue. Maybe the mind was simply doing what it has always done, monitoring, observing, searching for signals. The real question may be another. If the mind remains active while the system is still searching for safety, what happens when the body finally realizes it no longer needs to search? And what if, deep down, the busy mind was never a defect, but simply a system that had not yet received the signal that everything is okay?